This conference will now be recorded.
I'd like to welcome you along to evening 7 of the webinars for Management Accounting and Applied Finance. Tonight's coverage is units 10, 11 and 12. Now, I will just note with respect to your online assessment that's occurring this weekend, it only covers your 10 and 11. So last week we looked at 7, 8 and 9. This week we're doing 10, 11 and 12. I will just note that your online assessment does 7 through to 11, so to the end of working capital. It's just that we've only got one session after this session scheduled. I don't necessarily want to be trying to do 4 units in total with respect to 12, 13, 14 and 15. So I'm going to do as much on 12 as I can tonight. We might go over a couple of minutes. If I get it finished, great. If I don't, I'll just carry the end of it to the start of the next session in a fortnight's time. But I do just want to try to clear as much as we can this evening. As we start into the process, however, our start point is our Unit 10. Now, Unit 10 is the second of your cost management units. Again, Unit 9 looked at things such as your target costing and your cost volume profit. As you come across to Unit 10, it is more so about your allocation of overheads, utilising activity-based costing, and then extending that practically into customer profitability analysis. So you'll tend to find I break the Unit 10 down into traditional costing versus activity-based. I like to have a look at the Institute's little bit of qualitative coverage on cost hierarchy, cost pools, cost drivers. You will find calculations are typically required in this area. So as I've already said previously, there's a lot of back-ended calculations with this module. So as we move across 10, 11, 12, 13 and through, you'll find there's an awful lot of calculations you are having to do. And certainly one of those areas is your Unit 10. I'd have awarenesses of advantages and disadvantages of activity-based costing, and then I'd just make sure I understand the logic of customer profitability, which is where you're applying activity-based costing practically. So let's just work these areas through. Certainly from a traditional versus activity-based costing logic, from a visual representation, I'd like to think candidates are comfortable that with traditional, you're basically taking one cost pool and one cost driver. Now that may be labour hours, it may be machine hours, but fundamentally all those costs that cannot be allocated directly to a job, if you like, is treated as overhead, and you're having to allocate them across the jobs using a driver. With respect to traditional, it was always the basis, well, here's one pool, we'll have one driver. With activity-based costing, what it actually is just going into it in a little bit more detail. So you might have 4 cost pools, all with different cost drivers. Now, the only catch here is that as you engage with the Institute's material, just pick up on the fact they do make a representation that you can keep drilling into your overheads, keep segregating them down, and getting multiple cost pools, multiple cost drivers to get you a more precise costing position. They also do add, however, what cost is that going to incur for you, and is the benefit that you're going to get from the additional drill down into costing pools and cost drivers worth the time and effort and cost. So therefore, do not be surprised if you're given a scenario where, in this instance, you've got to identify your 3 cost drivers for your cost pools, and you may look at it and go, well, I would have preferred to actually gone further. Understand the Institute's logic is that you'll reach a cost benefit. All you need to know as a start point is, by contrast to traditional, where you have one cost pool, one cost driver, activity-based costing, you're taking that overhead pool and segregating it, and then each segregated component, each separate cost pool, has its own cost driver. If we then come back and consider traditional a little bit more, I've already noted that it's an overhead allocation using a single driver. Typically that will be labour hours or machine hours. And I would suggest if the Institute goes this path in the exam, it's going to have to be given to you. What is curious, however, is that the Institute, unless I'm missing something, I can't actually see where they explain traditional costing to you. They do show you calculations, and certainly within the activity 10.4, within the worked example 10.2, they've had you undertake calculations, and it's almost as though they assume you know how to do those calculations without necessarily explaining. So just make sure you appreciate that the Institute's expectation is that you can do traditional costing without necessarily showing you how to do it. So if it's something that you're uncomfortable with, you are just going to have to go that extra effort to work through the process. So if we look at that simply, if I give you a set of information with respect to Xerox bikes, we're manufacturing 2 bikes, the Raptor and the Specialist. You'll find I've given you all information around direct labour hours, machine hours, number of production runs, number of customer orders, number of raw material receipts. Now, you'll find I'm going to use this exact same information shortly as we apply activity-based costing. I've then given you your overhead costs. As you then turn the page, you'll find that I reference to the fact that we produce annually 60,000 Raptors, 20,000 Specialists, and we've got to calculate the overhead application rate using direct labour hours as our single driver. So, no, this is where we're talking traditional costing. You take your pool, which would be your 851,400, and you have to determine your cost driver rate on a per hour basis. You then convert that to a per unit. So the way you do this is you take your total overhead cost of your 851,400. Now, one of the catches with the activity-based costing, traditional costing area, is a number of candidates don't appreciate that it's all premised on you taking the total number. So note, I've got dividing through by the total number of direct labour hours, but you need to appreciate that I've got both the Raptor and the Specialist. So what I've actually got to do is with the Raptor, I take 60,000 units. Each unit takes 5 hours. With the Specialist, I take 20,000 units. Each Specialist takes 3 hours. So if I divide that through, I actually work out at 2.365. And guys, the Institute's a little bit inconsistent in this area with rounding, so I'll work with 2.365. Some questions you'll find they'll round it to 237, 236, that sort of logic. I'm just keeping it as a full number. But that's a rate per hour. If I'm then working out how much I would allocate to the Raptor, basically I take the Raptor, keeping in mind the Raptor takes 5 hours. I take my 5 by my 2.365, and each unit of Raptor would wear overhead of $11.82, $11.83, that sort of process. So again, if you're looking at that and going, yeah, don't really know how to do that, just make sure you understand that is assumed knowledge of the Institute. You'll find also, however, as they build from there, they then bring in the qualitative coverage on the cost hierarchy. Now, this is in both activity 10.1 and worked example 10.1. I'm yet to see it make any great appearance in an exam environment. I have seen it through the online assessment. So basically the cost hierarchy is breaking down the cost of the organisation into 4 groups, 4 levels. I would argue for the online assessment, just make sure that you are able to identify how you go about this process. Now, I would just note, worked example 10.1 is with respect to a ferry service. The activity is based on one of your case studies, based on the AccuTime. What I will note, however, if I've given you a ferry service for the worked example, I might then bring you into an airline type environment in the exam. And I would expect you to be able to take that worked example and go, well, if I'm looking at a unit cost, so it's a cost each time a unit is produced, then with respect to an airline, with respect to flights, the actual passenger is the actual unit. So therefore it would be cost with respect to ticketing, it would be cost with respect to baggage handling would be taken into account at that level. If I'm looking at a batch, to me, a batch of passengers would be taking a flight. So I would then look at costs incurred at a flight level. So I would look at costs with respect to employees. I would look at costs with respect to fuel. I might look at things like airport landing charges if I'm in that airline type environment, so the airport landing charge logic. If I'm then looking at product sustaining, you'll find this is activities required to support an entire product line. Now, again, if I use the logic of airlines, we tend to talk about airlines flying routes. So again, Sydney, Melbourne, Sydney, Los Angeles, whatever you want to talk about. Note in that instance, costs with respect to maintaining that route, whether that be advertising, air slots and the like, would be seen as product sustaining. And then facility sustaining, are those activities incurred to operate a business. So that would be things like your financing, your human resources, your strategy from an overriding level. Now, I think if they come here, it'll be more likely to be at the first three, not overly convinced that facility sustaining. So if I was to do this simply in the context of Morris Motorcycles and give you a series of costs, and we've got to categorize, we've got machining costs, costs of setting up machinery, engineering, procurement, and through. If I was to loosely work this through, the logic of my machining costs, I would treat as a unit cost that would be incurred on each individual bike. With respect to the cost of setting up machinery for a production run, so I'm doing more than one bike at a time, that would be the logic of my batch. Engineering costs with respect to designing, I have seen the Institute treat that as product sustaining. You've then got your procurement cost to purchase components, which is where you'd come back to your batch level. So you'd buy a batch of components. Processing orders from retailers would be product sustaining. The logic coming through with respect to promotional costs associated with advertising, I would argue would be product sustaining. And then if you look at distribution of orders to retailers, unless they're going to tell you that the facts that they are specialist bikes and they're only dealing with one at a time, I would treat it as a batch environment. Now, I do remake the point. Am I expecting you're going to be walked into the exam and you're going to have to identify cost level hierarchies? I would think if they did it, would only be one mark and you would have to explain why. I think the more probable path is you're going to see that area as you see your online assessment. So just make sure as you engage with the Institute's material that you're comfortable positioning, especially across the first three. But you'll note that's probably a little bit more of a qualitative question. And I could argue the same could be done for cost pools and cost drivers. So cost pools, as we've already noted, is that accumulation of costs incurred. I'll note that cost drivers are fundamentally the cause or consumption of a cost, and you should find that should only be one cost driver per cost pool. Now, can I have you engage with activity 10.2, which is where you're going through a simple process of identifying cost drivers for a series of cost pools. So it's a very good understanding activity as a start point, which you might look at it and go, oh, they wouldn't do that in the exam environment. Can I just suggest, guys, this 3214 question was a 3-mark question where you had 3 cost pools given to you and you had to work your way through and identify an appropriate cost driver for each cost pool. So it's got a little bit of life to it. Could argue that the Institute's not showing any interest there at the moment, but I would argue whilst ever that activity is sitting there, if the Institute needs a filler for the exam, you walking in and having to be able to identify cost drivers for a cost pool would not surprise. Once you've identified your cost pools and cost drivers, however, that's when you need to get into your calculations. Now, straight away, you'll note that we've got activity 10.3, activity 10.4, worked example 10.2, which are all based around you calculating using your activity-based costing formulas. I'll also note that it was 216 and 115 when we've seen probably the last of what I would call a direct activity-based costing question where you're basically looking at costing for a product. If you're looking at that and going, oh, they're not focusing on unit 10, I want you to note as we come over a little bit later that they're actually embedding activity-based costing at the moment, more so in customer profitability. So whilst at the moment you've got marks coming through with respect to, I think it was about 8 marks and 6 marks as components of the 216 and 115 questions, certainly you'll find, guys, they were larger questions from those, but the activity-based costing, you doing calculations were about the 8 and 6. That gives you a basic idea. You'll find in turn, once you've done your calculations, you need to base your decisions on the activity-based costing information to improve your profitability. So you take the information that you've gathered and look to take actions. Can I just suggest as you move forward, can you tag activity 10.3 for me? Guys, comprehensive activity. Looks at everything from generic strategy through to SWOT analysis, through to determination of total overhead costs using activity-based costing and through. So really good multi-unit activity for you to engage with. You'll note I've kept referencing to the formulas, however. There are 2. One is where you've got to calculate a cost driver rate. Now, you'll find that I talk about it as the activity cost pool. You might also see that referred to as the cost pool value. And you divide that through by the number of cost driver units. So you divide that through by the number of cost driver units to get your cost driver rate. If you then need to turn it into a per unit amount, however, that's where you take your driver quantity by your cost driver rate and divide it through by your number of units. Now, maybe easier to see using a set of numbers. So using the numbers that I had before, again, I've got the Raptor and the Specialist. I've got my overhead cost split between the production run, setup, machinery, handling, and through. So rather than allocating the 851 in one hit, we're now going to look at it if we were to allocate using activity-based costing with respect to, and we might, for our purposes tonight, just use the example of the production run setup area, which means as you engage, you'll find that cost drivers are given to you as 5 and 16. So if we're going to do that cost driver rate, which is what we've been asked for, you take your activity cost pool value, which is your 34,650. So that's the figure coming through from the facts here. You then divide that through by the total of the activity drivers. Now again, similar to the traditional, you take the 5 and the 16 and you get a rate of 1650 as your cost driver rate. But note, that's your cost driver rate, not your per unit rate. If we wanted to turn it into a per unit rate for the Raptor, what we do is that the Raptor does 5 setups by the 1650, divide through by the 60,000 units, which gets us a cost driver rate coming through at 0.1375. So that would be the amount that we would apply when we're calculating cost for the Raptor on a per unit basis. So just make sure as you're working through here, you're taking the time, engage with the formulas, know how to pull the detail together. Similarly, I noted that you need to be able to talk about advantages and disadvantages. Advantages basically allows you to build an understanding of the cause and effect relationship, acts as objective input into decisions. So when you're looking at areas such as product pricing, gives you a better cost to determine a price under a cost plus logic. Disadvantages, data collection can be time consuming and expensive, costs a fair bit to establish the system, and when you've got common costs, so those costs that can't be allocated to a particular pool, you've got issues with that allocation process. I would also suggest, however, that as you engage in this area, should the Institute ever reference to activity-based management, that is quite simply taking activity-based costing information and making decisions based on it. So you'll find that we can talk about modifying product prices, modifying product or customer mix, and we can look at our cost-cutting area. So again, if you're looking at this in an exam environment and going, well, how might they consider it? They could well consider it from you linking it to a price question, and through the one-day course for those of you that are joining me, that's one path we're going to take. The other path is they could look at it from a cost-cutting perspective to see, are there reductions that we can put in place with respect to product design, production processes to try to maximize our marks. As we build, however, I did highlight that with activity-based costing, one of the primary areas the Institute looks at it is with respect to customer profitability. You'll find I break customer profitability qualitatively down into the benefits, so you being able to understand by undertaking an analysis why customer costs are high. You can also understand those customers which are seen to be high cost customers. So we'll explain that as we go. Allows you to identify customers. So, and this is where you'd look at it in the context of, say, a McDonald's. If you're doing a suburban restaurant, McDonald's, you might group your customers as those that use the drive-through, those that come in, buy and eat in, those that come in, buy and take away. You would then do an analysis of each customer group to see where you can get improved profitability. You've got your calculations, but the key to this is probably understanding how you would use your analysis to try to improve your overall performance. On that basis, make sure when you're calculating, you'll need to calculate net profit for each customer or customer group. You'll need to, in terms of doing that calculation, apply your cost pool, cost driver logic. You'll find in turn you've got activity 10.5, activity 10.6. Now, activity 10.6, unless I'm missing something, is new this time. So they've now got 2 customer profitability questions as activities. you've got your worked example 10.3. But as I was saying, guys, this is where they've been doing the activity-based costing questions. You'll find that the 119 was a 12-mark question, multi-component. It wasn't all calculations. There was some marks you explaining why you would conduct a customer profitability analysis, for instance, and 6 marks in terms of a 317 environment. So as you engage with this area, you'll find the process is that you'll have details provided to you on, say, 3 customers. You'll be able to identify information to arrive at the gross profit. So how many units you've sold, what the cost per unit is, that sort of logic, what your selling price is. But where your activity-based costing comes in is through your allocation of all your overhead costs. So your activity-based costing will apply to your customer attributable costs, and that's where you'll apply the costs, potentially arriving at a positive, and negative, with the idea being that you would then take appropriate actions, make recommendations as to how to improve performance. So even if I look at this loosely, I can use underground, sell tanks for 1,200 to 3 customer groups. Cost of goods sold per tank is 900. Your sales and administrative expenses of 180,000 with respect to sales order, after sales and demonstration. Customer profitability report has been prepared, so as opposed to you constructing the numbers, I'm putting it into you in this form. And what you should be identifying is, note how, as is fairly common, you've got 2 positives, you've then got your negative in play. What I would highlight, however, is if they then ask you, well, what action would you take? Make sure that you understand that a lot of candidates will turn around and answer it by going, oh, with respect to the loss making, you would look to close the loss making. And this is the sort of point the Institute was trying to draw you to in the 119. Yes, you may look to close the loss making, the underperforming customer, but in turn, what you'd be looking at is, well, what do these costs cover? Are some of those costs fixed costs? Because if some are fixed, they're just going to rotate back onto customer 1 and customer 2, and you may not be in an overall better position. So you'll find the basic logic would become that with respect to your logic of your after sales and your demonstration, you try to find out why those costs are being incurred, and you try to change activity. So with after sales, is it something incorrectly done with respect to explaining the product to customer 3? If so, what actions can we take to improve that explanation process? With respect to demonstration, why are you doing so much time with demonstrating to customer 3? Do you need to provide, if you like, training to customer 3 so they have a better idea of how to conduct the demonstrations for their customers? So a couple of different elements that can be considered from that perspective. But I do come back. What I'm going to identify is that activity-based costing, I think, is always a chance. But I would also note that means you've got 6 fairly detailed activities across activity-based costing and customer profitability, and 3 worked examples. You'll also find, if we go back to the logic of the 216, the 317, the 119 exam, that it's also a fairly regularly examined area from a calculation base, anything from around 5 to 10 marks. So that's why I keep making the point. No, you don't see calculations to the same extent as what we once used to, but I would argue unless you commit time to doing these calcs, it's difficult under exam pressure to construct them quickly. So that's why you've got to have the experience. Once you're through all that, however, we can then jump through to our Unit 11 coverage. Now, with respect to our Unit 11 coverage, we are now moving on to our working capital. This is the final area of your online assessment 3. And you'll find the Institute talks initially around the types of capital, fixed capital, working capital, and growth capital. They then focus in on the working capital area. You'll find they look at the components with respect to what constitutes working capital, what creates effective management and assessing performance. But then as you look at your management of components, note you look at accounts receivable, accounts payable, and inventory, and you go through explanations as to what actions can be taken to improve your working capital position. You'll find that in turn is built into your activity 11.3, activity 11.4, and worked example 11.1. Before we go too much further, however, I will just pick up on the logic of what is working capital. I would argue historically, I have seen the Institute provide working capital as current assets less current liabilities, accounts receivable plus inventory less payable. Just make sure you understand that at the moment, the Institute's focus is on the receivable plus inventory less payable, which is distinct to Capstone for the last year or so. They've been doing current assets less current liabilities, which, as you can imagine, in management, if you're using receivable plus inventory less payable, and then come across to Capstone and all of a sudden you find they're using a different definition, that was creating some angst for candidates. Curiously, in Cap 319, they've now reverted back to this base formula. So I think for you guys, it just means that they're going to be even more pedantic in terms of you understanding working capital as your receivable plus inventory less payable, which means you should have the ability to do calculations both in dollars and in days, which means with respect to the days, you've got to make sure you've got access to your debtors days, inventory days, and creditors days formulas. You'll find with respect to those calculations, they are presented, if nowhere else, in the activity ratios of Unit 6. So they do represent them in Unit 11, but they do more detailed coverage with respect to your Unit 6 area. With respect to those formulas, however, average debtors by 365 on sales. Inventory days is your average inventory by 365 on cost of sales. Creditors days is your average trade creditors by 365 on purchases. Just make sure you understand how with purchases, sometimes you've got to calculate it. It's your cost of goods sold plus your closing inventory less your opening inventory. So you'll find if you've got access to my quick reference that I've got all these little formulas in play. Now, through to the fact that you've got multiple formulas in play and due to the fact that they can ask it as dollars or days, you do need to make sure that you understand the dollars is fairly straightforward. The days, you've got to make sure that you're appreciating the application. So again, we've got Ambrose prepared the following forecast sales information for 2020. Sales 24,165, cost of sales 14,265, gross margin 99. With respect to working capital, the forecast balances for June 2020 and the actual balances are for actual for June 19, 975, 1995 and 850. Forecast for June 20 is your 1,050,000, your 2415 and your 900,000. You'll find as you build from that, if the question was you being asked to calculate your working capitals in dollars at June 2019, just take your inventory, add your receivable, take away your payable. So once again, note how I'm just trying to illustrate. You've got to watch what the question is asking for. If you're asked to calculate forecast debtors days at 30 June 2020, it's your average. So I take the actual and then I take the logic coming through with respect to my forecast. I add those together and divide by 2. Multiply by 365, picking up on the fact that the formula is with respect to sales, which is where, again, I come back, 24,165. So my debtors days is calculated at my 33.3. Now, you will find in this area that the Institute doesn't round. I'll talk later about inventory and how they do, but in this area, you would leave it at the 33.3, the 22.6, whatever the number may be. As you've then got that base logic under control, we then look at the coverage around effective management. Now, you'll find as a start level that if you're giving consideration to the optimal level, you're looking at considering your cash conversion cycle. So from the time you spend money, how long does it take you to convert that into inventory, sell the inventory and retrieve the receivable? And that should be the shortest possible period. Now, what I would note within the Institute's material is just note they do use the language of taking it to the extreme would see you eliminating or holding minimal inventory, only taking sales on a cash basis, stop paying creditors or extend beyond payment terms. Now, what I'm just trying to highlight here, their language is taking that to the extreme. What I need you to appreciate, I have seen candidates give answers when they've been asked to, how would you improve the inventory position? And they'll say, stop holding inventory. Now, receivable, well, don't offer credit terms, just charge cash. Well, that's when the Institute wants you to understand that would be taking it to the extreme, and that is just as likely to do as much damage to brand and reputation than meeting those requirements. They also at this point link it across to your funding type area, and they do make the observation that with respect to working capital, there's permanent working capital, and then you've got variable or temporary. So note they talk about with permanent, you would fund with long-term financing. With your variable or temporary, so this should fluctuate with operating cycles, you should fund that with short-term. Now, the reason I'm highlighting that is we're going to see short-term and long-term as we come across to Unit 14 and Unit 15. So if they ask you, you've got permanent working capital, how would you finance? I would argue if they're going to be consistent with what they're representing, they should be talking that from a Unit 15 perspective. Once we understand what creates effective management, however, we then come across to assessing performance. Now, note straight away how, as we're assessing performance, I'm just dropping back to utilisation of debtors days, inventory days, creditors days, and through. And I've got that all as part of a combination in determining our working capital days. In terms of assessing that performance, however, we'll find that we've had a raft of questions in this area. So note straight calculation questions. 117 was a question for 3 marks. The additional working capital was a 3-mark question. The calculate your additional investment in working capital was an 8-mark question. So 214 is a much broader perspective. Note with respect to explain and evaluate, the 119 was a 4-mark, you just having to explain the impact of a marketing campaign on the different elements of your working capital. Note 9 marks with respect to the 117. Guys, that 117 question, if you can get your hands on that, strongly recommend it. It was basically 20 marks built all around working capital and through. And certainly with that 9 mark and you having to evaluate how working capital was being measured or managed, 9 marks, the Institute passed a comment. They were surprised by the number of candidates that gave like 3 responses. If it's 9 marks, they were expecting basically 9 points being made. Working capital projections was a 4-mark. Working capital management was a 3-mark. So again, some of those are components thereof. If you're looking at that and going, well, but what do you mean by this? Calculate the additional investment in working capital. Note the Institute's expectation is that if they give you current information and part forecasted, you should be able to determine what working capital position is required in the future. So if I use the example of Easton, they've requested your assistance in determining the extra funding required to support its planned increase in working capital. They've told you the 2019 results are sales, cost of sales, purchases, debtors, inventory, and creditors. So sales at 5 million, cost of sales at 4,250, purchases at 3,350, and through. As we turn the page, sales forecast is given to you as 5,750. They've then told you that if debtors days are estimated at 50 days, then the estimated debtors balance at 30 June 2020 could be determined. Now, do not be surprised if you see one of these in the online assessment. It's been a fairly regular point of reference. So you'll find the logic is that we've given you 50. That 50 would equal your average trade debtors by 365 on your forecast sales figure, which means my average trade debtors, as I work my formula through, comes at 787,671. What I then need to observe, however, is that my average trade debtors is my opening plus my closing divided by 2. Now, I was given opening trade debtors at the 750, so that's that figure there. So I can therefore take my 750 plus my closing on 2 to get 787, work that through, and my closing trade debtors becomes 825. So the increase in actual working capital in that instance is 75,342. And this is where they allow you to go, well, this is the additional funding that is required to meet the working capital requirements. So again, note how I'm taking you down different paths of calculations. If we then move away from the calculation element, however, we then come through to the logic of accounts receivable, payable, and inventory. Note with your accounts receivable, it's basically providing credit terms, so a time frame within which to pay. The Institute would suggest you should consider the factors that might influence the credit terms you are going to offer. So industry average, competitive and marketing considerations, creditworthiness, which is basically where they're making the point later in the coverage that before you offer credit, you should check credit references, do have a credit policy in play, put in place follow-up procedures. But that's when you'll then find as a mid-ground, they come back to techniques. So They did a smaller 2-mark question in 313. You'll find that the activity 11.1 is you looking at the implications of providing extended terms. I would then suggest that as part of that, you were looking at the different techniques that were available to manage receivables. So note again, if you were to engage with the candidate study guide, page 11-7, they have a table where they, and this is just some of the suggestions: establish credit policy, make invoicing clear and understandable, invoice earlier, offer early settlement discounts, and make the point, guys, some candidates will look at that table and go, oh yeah, that's too simplistic, I need a higher level answer. I've seen the Institute accept an answer in the exam as invoice earlier. So do not step past the easy marks that may be available. You'll also find in this area, however, they do reference to factoring and invoice discounting. These are also covered in Unit 14, but just understand factoring is when you are selling your debtor ledger at a discount to book value. The purchaser collects the debts. Invoice discounting. Now, please note, invoice discounting is not you offering early settlement discounts as most candidates interpret. It's basically where a finance company will provide a debt facility based on the discounted value of invoices that you've issued. So you might have 100,000 worth of invoices. They will provide you an advance of 90,000. You are the one still collecting the debt, however, because you need to repay the advance. Now, the key here to appreciate is, note with factoring, the purchaser collects the debts. With respect to our invoice discounting, the company still will collect the debt. So if you're sitting in an exam and you're having to provide advice as to which path to follow, just pay attention to whether we have, in the first instance, staff available to collect the debts. Maybe they're out of control because our staffing level in that area is reduced because of employee turnover, whatever it may be. Once you've then understood your techniques, we can move across to our accounts payable. Note, you're paying on credit terms. The ideal is to extend payment terms. You'll find some techniques are to make payments only when due, prioritise suppliers, negotiate extended terms, seek alternative suppliers, consider the benefit of early settlement. You'll note through there, however, that nowhere have I said that you don't pay. And understand, guys, that will not earn you marks in an exam. If you just turn around and go, well, how are you going to manage the accounts payable? I don't pay them. That will not be rewarded. You've got to use language of, make payment only when due, that sort of language. You'll also find, however, with respect to issues to consider, you'll find the Institute talks about attempting to extend too far may impact upon your supplier relations, so they may reduce terms, change to cash on delivery, increase prices, cease supply. But I will just reiterate, in this area you must be specific. So what I mean by that, I've got Ambrose has prepared the following information for the year ended June 2020. Got my sales at 24,165, cost of sales at 14,2, gross margin 9,9. With respect to my working capital, I've got my forecast and actual for 2020 and 2019. And then I've been requested to determine how to manage the accounts payable more effectively. So if we were to calculate our forecast creditors days, they are working out at 22.3 days. To manage more effectively, and note how specific I'm being, pay to term if terms are greater than 22. Guys, if you just say pay to term, the terms haven't been represented. So you've got to go with this line of if terms are greater. You would negotiate extended terms if terms are less than 22 days, and you'd look to prioritise suppliers as a third reference point. Again, just picking up on the different paths that we have available to us. The third area with respect to your working capital is your inventory. Note with respect to inventory, you've got your costs of inventory, of which there are 3, which I'll explain in a moment. Basically, the idea with inventory is to extend to impact on your cash conversion cycle. So if you can hold inventory longer, then there's possible higher borrowing levels, resulting in increased interest cost. So that's the idea of you understanding the implications of inventory. They talk about an optimal level of inventory. So it's a level required to avoid stock outs. You do need to give consideration to your lead time, so how long it takes for product to be shipped in. But you're also going to need to give consideration to the ability to forecast your inventory levels, your seasonality and promotions, and the logic of your shelf life. So what life does the product have? Excuse me. And then as we build, we come across to our inventory control models. Now we saw just in time and TQM back in our unit 3 area. The other two that you get introduced at this point is your economic order quantity and your reorder point. So a couple of areas that I need to reflect on here. First of all, with the 3 costs, make sure you understand that an ordering cost is a cost incurred in ordering and receiving inventory. Carrying, cost of holding until stock is used, so insurance, interest on borrowed funds, spoilage and obsolescence. Stock out, incurred when organisations run out of stock or production disrupted. So that's where you look at loss of product on lost sales, profit foregone on lost customers and through. Now, the reason I'm showing you is that activity 11.2 takes you through the determination of your inventory costs. But I want you to note the language. So order is costs incurred in ordering and receiving. Carrying is costs of holding. Now, as we move forward into our EOQ, we'll see some of this terminology is used. So I'm just curious as to whether one day the Institute might turn around and give you a scenario where the logic comes through with respect to the process of you determining your different carrying cost, your ordering cost and through. So the point I'm just representing, they may not use the language out of the EOQ formula directly. You may have to come back to this language to make the determination. To group that together, however, you'll find that with respect to your inventory control models, you've got the logic of calculating, reordering, and the logic of your just-in-time and TQM. So with respect to EOQ, you've got your calculate. A couple of points that we need to understand. Really good activity in activity 11.2 as you're working through the determination. And note we had a 6-mark question in 218. 4 marks of that was calculation based. So I would argue the fact that it was there in 218 may be too soon for it to go back again, but I'd certainly expect to see an EOQ calc in the online assessment. Don't think there's any doubt that you'll see one there. Reorder, we're going to have a look at reorder point and safety stock. And then in terms of your just-in-time and TQM, again, just-in-time is where your purchasing reduces the cost of warehousing, obsolescence and cost of capital tied up in inventory. TQM, total quality management out of unit 3, aims to minimise or eliminate defects and rework thereby reducing costs. Of these 3, however, I want to start with EOQ. Basically, it's formula based. You take the square root of 2DP over C, D being your demand in units, P being your ordering cost per purchase order, C being your carrying cost. So this is where I was making the point. They use this language in the formula. Do not be surprised, however, if you've got to use the actual determination of what is an order cost or what is a carry cost to determine those numbers. So they may embed it slightly. Points to understand, however, is that as you give an EOQ, you must give it as a whole unit. So you must round it up, much like cost volume profit. The D and C, the demand and the carrying costs, must be the same time period. Noting in the Institute's material, they do make the point that if they are silent on what time frame their carry cost is, it will be interpreted as an annual period. So your demand would have to turn annual. Wastage, you would add to demand. Required return, you would add to your carry cost. So if we build that through, pick up on the fact that we've got Ambrose, decide to use EOQ model to limit its inventory holdings. Following information is available cost of placing an order is $5 per order. Annual demand is 42,000 units. Cost of holding a unit for 1 month is 50 cents. So straight away, I trust you've noted I've gone annual demand, cost of holding for 1 month. So we're going to have to equate those as we do our formula. To do that, I'm going to do 2 by the 42 on 5 by 5, divide through by the 0.5 times 12, gets 264.6. To get our answer in this area, we are going to have to round it up to 265. Now, in the online assessment, they will give you the 264.6. They'll give you 264 and they'll give you 265. Make sure you round up. A really good inbuilt example in this area, as you come across to page 1113. So I would suggest if you can take the time and work that through, that would be a very good reference point, even in an exam environment. As we then look to build from that, once you've got your EOQ, you may have to do a reorder point. Your reorder point is the level of inventory on hand at which an order should be placed to replenish stock. You'll find there is a calculation base in play. When you've got safety stock, you'll find that stockouts may arise due to fluctuations in demand, inaccurate forecasting, suppliers not having stock to meet an order, transportation delays, and this sheet again takes you through how you would do those calculations. So the base logic is reorder point is number of units sold in a period by lead time. So lead time is how long it takes the product to be from the distributor to you as the retailer, if you like. So if you're going to order stock, how long does it take to get to you? Note, if that takes 1 week, the number of units sold must be based on a weekly basis. So you've got to have that combination. If it's a reorder point including safety stock, it's the number of units sold by lead time plus your safety stock. Noting that your safety stock is your maximum use for a period of time, less your average use by a period of time. So again, if lead time is 7 days, then what's your maximum use per day to your average use per day? So it'd be 10 minus 6 would 4, 4 by 7 would be 28, so you'd want 28 units as safety stock. And again, we'll find that that smaller calculation is something that the Institute has expected candidates to be able to do more so in an online assessment environment. As you'll highlight for yourself through there, however, guys, working capital management, the focus is receivables, payable, inventory. Lots of these little calculations you've got to be able to do. So just make sure that you've taken the time to work those through, especially for the online assessment this weekend. For our purposes, however, what I want to do is then just use the balance of the night to get a little bit of a head start on our Unit 12 coverage. Now, I may just go a couple of minutes over if I think that gives us half a chance of completing this area so that next time up, we're just worrying about 13, 14, and 15. But basically, as you come across to Unit 12, you are considering your cost of capital and your capital budgeting. Your cost of capital is where you're looking at your weighted average cost of capital, understand how to calculate, understand limitations. As you're looking at your capital budgeting, you've got to look at your methodologies of net present value, internal rate of return and through, understand the logic of sensitivity analysis, and to apply behavioural or qualitative. So if we just start with our weighted average cost of capital, I break it down into 3. 1, calculations. You'll find you've got 2 activities, and we've had 3 questions all across this area with respect to calculations of 6, 7, and 11. Now, admittedly, some of those have been slightly larger questions around re-gearing, but they do give you an example of the sort of areas that can be in play. You'll find that both activity 12.1 and 12.2 utilize your calculations, of which you've got a formula and a table basis. I'm going to give you both of those. With respect to the components to these formulas, you may be given the numbers, but do not be surprised if you have to calculate. And you'll find that the limitations with your weighted average cost of capital include that your proposed investments may have different risk characteristics, which we sort of accommodate by looking at our re-geared logic. But I'll come back to these formulas. I've already said you've got a formula basis and a table basis. I'm going to show you both. Formula basis, you take your cost of debt, 1 minus the tax rate, to D on your V. Now, just note your V is your total value of funding. So just make sure you understand you divide your total of debt through by your total of debt and equity. The other way, now that's very good if you've got 1 item of equity and 1 item of debt. If you've got multiple, so if you've got 1 item of equity and 2 items of debt, for instance, you might move more to this process where you would then do a weighting type logic. So if I've got, let's say I've got an amount of 10, 20, and 30, then the weight for the second debt is 50%. The weight for the logic coming through with respect to the first debt would be 33 1/3%, something of that sort of logic. You then take your pre-tax cost and your after-tax cost, and then by the time you've multiplied through, you take your amount by your weighting, by your after-tax cost. That weighting by your after-tax cost would give you your weighted average. But let's just see that. If I use the formula basis, all I've got is Louis, ordinary shares on issue at a value of 400,000, cost of equity of 17%. Also has a bank loan to a value of 600, been borrowed at a before tax rate of 12%, tax rate is 30. Calculate the WACC. Now, note, I've only got 1 item of equity, 1 item coming through with respect to debt. So therefore, I can use the formula. I'm taking my rate of debt, my cost of debt at 12%, multiplying it through by 1 minus the tax rate. I'd need to turn it into an after-tax effect, which if I had been given that as after-tax, I wouldn't have been multiplying through. I just would have taken the after-tax figure. But then I'm doing the weighting. Note I am 400 and 600. So 400 would be 0.4, 600 0.6. In that instance, my weighted average cost of capital would be the 11.84. As I do my online assessment coverage previously, so note previously, guys, this area used to be part of the online assessment. It's been removed from it. So you'll find that previously they used to give you things like relief has 10 million ordinary shares on issue that sell for $1.50 per share, cost of equity of 13.8%. Relief also has 3 million 10% preference shares on issue that sell at $2.50 per share, bank loan to a value of 2 million, which has been borrowed at a before tax rate of 7.5, tax rate is 30%, calculate the WACC. Well, note how I've got to do a little bit more legwork. My ordinary shares are my 10 million by the $1.50. That gets me my 1.5 million. The preference shares are my 3 million by the $2.50. Gets me my 7.5. 15 divided by 24.5 gets 61.23. 7.5 by 24.5 gets 30.61. And then 2 divided by 24.5 gets 18.16. Note I said that debt was 7.5%. My equity was 13.8 and 10 respectively. But then I trust what you're noting. As I move my debt, I turn it into an after-tax amount. So 7.5 multiplied by 1 minus the 0.3. Note my equity. I do not get a tax deduction for my dividends. So my equity stays as a before tax figure. I then take my 13.8 by 61.23 and I get 8.45. 10 by 30.61 gets me by 3.06. My 8.16 by my 5.25 gets me a 0.43. Add those down and I get 11.94. So again, we get the appreciation of how we've got to build these numbers through. We then also appreciate, however, I was using cost of equity and cost of debt. Now, with both, understand with cost of debt, yes, the Institute does give you the calculation. It is quite likely in that area, however, that they will give you the number. I've never seen the Institute in an exam environment in particular have you calculate cost of debt. Cost of equity, however, is a different beast. You will find that there are multiple formulas. I will argue that it's quite probable that you're going to have to apply the capital asset pricing model. So to that degree, I can talk about under dividend valuation models. You've got the single period dividend valuation, you've got your general dividend valuation and through. They're all nice knowledge to have. Maybe in the online assessment, I doubt it, but maybe in the online assessment. Guys, I don't think there's any doubt that you need to make sure you can understand the short form of the capital asset pricing model and that you can do your calculations in this area. So if we work that logic through, you'll find that your cost of equity using your capital asset pricing model is your cost of equity equals your risk-free rate, which is typically your government bond rate, plus beta, and I'll explain beta in the moment, multiplied through by your return on the market, so that's your return on the market, less your risk-free rate. Now, what I might just note, if you ever see the Institute reference to the market premium, that is that component of the formula. The RM minus the RF is the market premium. So sometimes I'll just give you the market premium and you can use that number. Now, you're probably looking at that, okay, government bond rate, treasury bond rate, I can find that. Return on market, fairly straightforward. What does the beta mean for me? Well, guys, before we get to explain the beta, simplistically, Lewis has ordinary shares on issue at a value of 4 million, beta of 1.25. Current interest rate for a 10-year government bond is 7%. Current overall return for the All Ords index is 15. Calculate the cost of equity. Well, I've got my logic coming through with respect to my risk-free rate of 7%. Add to that the beta, less your multiplied by your return on the market being the 15, less your government bond rate. Gets me 17% as my figure. So Again, note how I've constructed that initially. I did, however, suggest, one thing that you may need an awareness of is the beta. Now, this is the estimate of the systematic risk of a security. Understand the market index has a beta of 1. So it is quite likely that they'll give you the beta, as I just did. They could, however, give you to you as a relationship against a listed entity. So I've seen questions where they've gone, you're twice as risky as the market, and they've expected you to understand the beta in that instance would equal 2. So if the market has a beta of 1 and you're twice as risky, your beta would be 2. They've also got the logic of your risk changing, which was tested in both 119 and 115. Because it was there for 6 marks in 119, I would admit I'm not as committed to it this time. I was certainly pushing it last time through, but I just make sure that I can do my little bit of work up through here, apply my activity 12.1, but understand the logic is that as you go and change your financing for a business when you buy another asset, then you may want to accommodate a re-gear logic in terms of calculating your WACC. So you'll find they give you formulas to ungear your beta and re-gear your beta. So your formula to ungear your beta is you take your currently geared beta, divide that by 1 plus 1 minus the tax rate, multiplied through by the proportion of debt to equity. You then take that figure that you've calculated and you then multiply it back out by 1 minus the tax rate, multiplied through by debt on equity. So multiply it through by 1 plus 1 minus the tax rate, multiplied through by your debt on equity. To illustrate that sort of logic, we take Morrisita's, has a current capital structure, ordinary shares of 4, debt of 6. The debt is held with Northpac Bank, who has requested that they'd prefer the debt equity to be 0.8 in market terms, and this is to be achieved by an equity issue to repay some bank debt. Other information includes that the company is being assessed as 50% riskier than like listed entities with current cost of equity of 14%. Tax rate is 30. Calculate the revised cost of equity. So note, we've got to start by calculating the current cost of equity. To calculate our current cost of equity, my apologies, as we work our way through there, that was given to us as 14. We've then got to do our ungear re-gear. So our ungear, note how I've taken where the current beta is 1.5 because we're 50% riskier than the market. We divide that through by 1 plus the 1 minus 0.3. Noting they've told us we've got 6 of debt, 4 of equity. So 1.5 on 2.05 gets us 0.73. We then need to re-gear that. So to re-gear it, we take our 0.73, multiply through by 1 plus 1 minus the tax rate, multiplied by the new debt to equity. Now that is what they've requested the new debt to equity to be. So we would then multiply through by that 0.8 and get our new geared beta of 1.14, which we would apply, my apologies, which we would apply in terms of taking our cost of equity, in terms of determining our revised cost of equity. So we would take our logic coming through. Our cost of equity is our risk-free rate. As I've just got myself caught there for a moment, guys, my apologies. Let me just check something here for me if I can. I seem to have missed a little bit of information on that screenshot. So basically what you're doing is that as you've worked your way through, we suggested that you would come up, you would take your re-geared, would give you your re-geared beta, would be your 1.14, and then you'd put that back through that cost of equity calculation. So my apologies, guys. That screenshot should have been to calculate the revised or the geared beta, I should suggest. My apologies as you work through that process. So I've just mislined that last. So you were calculating the new geared beta if the requested capital structure is employed was what you're looking for in the first instance. But again, guys, just trying to get you to think through the different points that are represented once you come across into your coverage of your unit 12. You'll then find as we build out of that, however, we then come across into our capital budgeting type area. you'll find that with respect to capital budgeting, we've got our different methodologies, being our net present value, internal rate of return, payback and accounting rate of return. You'll find in 117, this was a theoretical question, a qualitative question, where you had to work out and describe which was the most appropriate methodology to employ. So again, they didn't, in that instance, get you to do a calculation. You were doing the most appropriate methodology. You then worked your way through your sensitivity analysis coverage with respect to activity 12.5, and we looked at our behavioural and qualitative issues. Now, I'm pushing there at 8 o'clock. Guys, I think I might hold it at that point. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's going to take me another 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get through the balance of that coverage, which we should be able to accommodate next time up. I just wasn't wanting to do the whole unit. So I'm going to hold the coverage there. We will start off our next evening with a look at capital budgeting once you've probably had a little bit more of a chance to look at it. But just keep in mind that this weekend you've got your third online assessment, which is your units 7 through 11. We are on again on the Tuesday the 26th, where we'll close out that unit 12 coverage, and then we'll come across and work our way through our unit 13, 14 and 15. So at that time of the night, happy to stay and answer any questions you may have, but at that stage I will call it and catch up with you in a fortnight's time. So guys, if you've got questions, feel free to hang on. Otherwise, we'll catch up in a fortnight. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jackson.
Cheers, Graham.
Thanks, Nicholas. All right, guys, I'll call a night there. Thanks, everyone.